All right, Warner, go ahead.
Well, I sure appreciate everybody being here. My first time doing this, so let me make sure I know how to do it right. There we go. I hope you can see it okay. Interrupt me if there's any problems or if I'm doing something wrong. Certainly if it gets too boring, I hope it won't. But this is about the Bears Paw Southern. It's operating in large scale. Most of you don't really realize how a layout might operate outdoors and indoors in large scale, but we do that. So I want to try to walk you through both the layout, which is not your typical garden layout necessarily, as well as how we operate. I'm a 75-year-old semi-retired psychiatrist in Portland. I've been a lifelong model railroader, MMR, and NMRA. Majority of my adult life has been in HO, so I do speak HO. But about 1990, when US prototypes became available, I converted over to G scale, mainly because space was the final frontier. I had planned an enormous addition to our home. We had a half an acre. My kids looked outside and they said, "Dad, why don't you put something outside?" And that was it. Life sort of changed as far as my railroading interest at that point, but I still wanted to operate. This is a flashback to the Glacier Northern in 1994. It was a very nice railroad. I've been on a couple of magazine covers. We did operate, we ran trains, but it was limiting. What you can do, it was not running in circles, which I abhor, but it was a previous layout. I was very proud of it. Half acre, expansive. I keep wanting to do more. What it did instill in me, however, was in large scale, you could get the feeling of going from one place to another. And that's what I hope to carry over the rest of my modeling career. The original town of Glacier was in 1994, like this. It was rather quaint, but again, it gave me the feeling of going from someplace. The new town of Glacier at the Bears Paw Southern is a little bit more expansive, but still keeps the small railroad feeling. The Bears Paw Southern was initially a downsize from the Glacier Northern. It was meant to be a token garden railroad, but it organically kind of grew. I'm sure most of you who are model railroaders know what it means for a railroad to grow. Street view of our new home on the corner of Bears Paw and Equestrian. We picked this lot. I told my wife it was because of the view, but I actually picked it because I love the names of the streets. I said, that's the railroad right there. Bears Paw at Equestrian. So ordinarily you're walking around the sidewalk, it looks like a typical neighborhood lot, sort of, only if you get close, you realize there's a railroad track running around the front yard. And these ugly posts, which sort of stick in there, are not telegraph poles, but they actually support our Christmas lighting and our holiday lighting when we put it up, and illuminate the railroad at holidays such as Halloween. And I'll show you a picture or so of it's running in those areas. I'm going to move through some of these motion pictures. Don't want to take too long of your time, but to get an idea of what the trains look like actually moving around the front yard. This is what you'd see if you walked around the sidewalk. If you'll let me go ahead. So originally, the railroad was just a demonstration or display loop in our front yard, and it disappeared through two holes in the front fence, but it grew. I decided, well, we got to run trains, so into the side yard I went and built an sort of a figure eight, looped over itself and came back out. That was logical. But of course, it needed to add a branch line that would go along the house where we could stage trains to run them in and out. That wasn't enough. So we actually added a whole display loop so that the layout in the front yard could be run as a loop, particularly at Halloween when people want to just see trains running. Well, that's the way it kind of evolved. Phase two gradually expanded further. We took out this part of the loop down here, this blue line, and the layout gradually grew to encompass our entire backyards and side yards. This is what you'd look like if you walked up to the house. There's a mountain, so to speak, here in front, which is a water feature, a waterfall that runs year round. into what was a pond, but because of hazards to neighborhoods, kids, we filled it in and it's a walk-on pond now. So the pond is actually below the rocks. And when we put it in the loop, had to trestle across it. So now this is called Dry Lake. And that's what this town evolved to being. The town of Somnia is out of view here on the right under the railing of the front porch. And this is the town of Limber, a logging town up here, which will actually soon be put into use as we have to start logging some of these miniature trees that are overgrown. So quickly, the town of Somnia, and we'll move through some of the visual stuff here. The national initial track plan, as I described, was sort of a figure eight, but it just grew. It evolved into a dual route. Both legs of that figure eight grew to go around and encompass the entire backyard. So the layout gradually has gone from Glacier to around the entire yard to Bipolar, and ultimately to the town of Bears Paw, which is in the basement. If we zoom out, it's kind of overwhelming for you, I'm sure. I don't even know if you can all see this, and we will go back and forth with schematics to help you understand what we're looking at. The front yard is just this little area up here in the upper right-hand corner. The town of Glacier is here along the side of our house. And the two legs of the layout that have evolved into what is actually a giant compressed loop encircle the entire backyard. To the lower areas, there's a big pond here in the lower area. We go around it to the town of Bipolar, but you'll sort of see why it's called that. A connecting Y that goes into the basement, as well as a continuing loop around the other side of our driveway house that allows for continuous looping of the main line. As I said, I kind of abhor loops, but it's a dual purpose railroad. The interior in the basement, which is completely filled, and this is about 30 by 60 feet, with a layout, is also operationally oriented, goes from the town of Eufaula, which is theoretically the most southern point of the railroad, where it connects with the SP and other transcontinental railroads, through the town of Bears Paw, looping around the basement to the major intersection or division point, if you will, of the town called New Rotic, obvious puns, and out from New Rotic, where all of our staging is done for operating on the outside or Glacier Division of the railroad. So the layout itself outdoors is 100 by 100 feet. It was started about 2002. It's all G gauge track, which is gauge 1 track 45 millimeter. And if you're familiar with G gauge, you realize we run several scales on G gauge. Most of the diesels in modern era, which we operate primarily, are 1 to 27 or 1 to 29. Steam, usually representing narrow gauge, is a larger scale, 1 to 22. As a compromise, all of my structures routinely are built to 1 to 24. There's about 2,500 feet total trackage right now at 120 turnouts last time I tried to count. But the mainline run outdoors is about 750 feet. So we call the outdoor division Glacier. And the set out capacity, which you'll be more interested in terms of operating, is over 100 cars, 100 freight cars on industrial sidings. All turnout control is done manually by the train crews. It's a walk around railroad for operation. You walk with your train. There is no centralized control. It's all dead rail, radio control, and there's no signaling except by radio and what we call smoke signals, which literally uses the horns and whistles on the engines to communicate, as well as flagging in terms of staying ahead of where your train is and where the next siding is. All couplers are upgraded to KD, all wheel sets are metal, and the grades don't exceed 3.5%, so there's no plan for helper. The development of the railroad was designed to fit into our other interests. We like growing grapes. We have a small vineyard on this standard size lot of about 70 vines, and we grow a 1/4 ton of grapes on a good year. That's Chateau Bears Paw. So the layout has to fit in with our other interests. Also ponds and waterfalls, which are my wife's interests. And we have year-round waterfalls running in the backyard and ponds raising koi, some of them more than 18 inches. A quick overview in winter showing our high trellising. All of our vines are overhead, 8 to 9 feet over our heads, and the railroad runs under it on mountains and scenic areas. The lower area of the railroad looks more like a conventional indoor layout. It's not scenic particularly, and it gets populated with many of our industries. If I kept one part of the layout and had to get rid of the rest, this is the most interesting operationally oriented part. As you can imagine from the track layout there, it's quite a switching challenge and a lot of fun to run. But you can see here the overhead trellising that pretty much encircles the entire layout. At harvest time, the trains are actually put to use. We actually harvest grapes into hopper car unit trains, which run down to area we call Crusher and at Bipolar. My wife there dumping grapes into the destemmer, and my friends helping to crush the grapes into good juice, which we then have one segment left in the basement that's a wine cellar. Well, that's Chateau Bears Paw. It's a dual purpose railroad, but also we have two modes of operation. The two modes of operation are our other two ways we like to use our railroad. One is for demonstration, to enjoy it, to run and to show. The other is to interact and to operate. It's a hands-on layout, but we have tours regularly that are garden railroad tours as well as other types of outings. We've hosted television shows here in the yard. And so we operate in one mode for touring where the trains do run fairly continuously with 4 to 6 operators keeping trains moving. But on operation, scheduled operation or formal operation periods, we operate differently. Not exactly point to point, but I'll go over what I mean by ops sig light. We try to blend realism with humor. This is a church group tour. We had about 30, 35 people come during the summer to visit, enjoy the layout. The kids love it. It's an enjoyable area for them to see the trains run. And Halloween, it's also a very popular stop in the front yard where we run trains and have over 200 visitors on a typical Halloween night. And it looks something like this when we're operating at night. The house is lit up, front yard lights, and we put up the holiday lights as a perimeter. Just to get an idea of a fun operation. As I mentioned, it's all dead rail. Lights and sounds are an essential part of operating. Dual route, I'll explain that in a minute. It runs as a single track main line with 6 major towns or passing sidings, dual ended passing sidings. The railroad cannot run unattended. You essentially have to be present and operate with your engine. There are wyes and abilities to reverse loops at both ends of the layout, as well as the inside section, but we don't run that during operating. There are crossovers, which we don't use during an operating session, typically unless we're doing complex switching maneuvers. The third phase of an operating session allows operators to do turns where they go out and just switch a region, like I showed you. In that case, I'll show you the crossovers that can be used. We try to engage with our geography so the layout sort of progresses and the industries are still growing. We have 24 sites on the outdoor division for industries. As I said, the capacity is about 104 freight cars. We do change the locations right now of some of the industries as I'm still building structures, and these are pretty large structures. And once in a while, we'll actually switch it, but the operators don't seem to mind. They're more interested in the location than what the name of the industry is. Siding lengths for passing typically are about 16 feet, which allows a car maximum for heading in both directions of about 10 cars, but trains as long as 40 plus cars have been run. Local freights, when we're operating, typically average about 8 cars plus a caboose. And I'll explain that when we get to operating. This is a schematic of the Glacier Division or outdoor area. Trains can leave from Glacier or they can leave from Bipolar, where we stage our trains. The colors of the industrial sidings noted here help operators stay oriented if their trains are northbound or southbound. And again, in a moment, I'll try to explain that a little more clearly. Most G-scalers are not operation oriented. We have over 120 active members in our Garden Railway Society here, which is actually more active than the NMRA in Portland. About a dozen of these layouts operate to some degree rather than just run demonstrationally or in circles. And only about 5, to my knowledge, actually have some form of operating session. So I'm trying to break the ice, and in doing so have gotten a small cadre of operators to transition into visiting and operating with us on the Bears Paw. What we're doing right now is opening this up for more small indoor gaugers that might want to come and enjoy operating outdoors. This is what it looks like operating Glacier now in the outdoor area. Glacier is removed during the winter, as are the backdrops. You'll see some photos have backdrops up and some don't. So it varies as to the season or what time I took the pictures. But this is Glacier, and I'll show you some other pictures in a minute. The layout is operation based. It's a freight line primarily. It, in my imagination, is a bridge line between my old Glacier Northern, which served the northern states, sort of the Great Northern, connecting with my former HO layout, which was the Cascade Southern, which was more in California. So I sort of see this as a bridge line somewhere connecting between Glacier in the north and towns in California. No actual locations are tried to be represented. It's all imaginary. So it's a bridge line, and we primarily operate early diesels, 50 to 60s. Again, a reference to the schematic. We won't be looking at the indoor area, but we have and will look at the outdoor front yard loop, the side yard with Glacier opposed to it, a walkway between, and we will go around the layout a little bit through Griswold, Batson to Belfry, and down to the Lakemont region. This is a scenic area, and you'll see that the scenery kind of progresses from mountainous in the front yard to more mining and industrial on the eastern part, equestrian, to scenic, large lake, long bridge, into the Belfry area, which is agricultural and essentially developing more animal, bull, if you will, products, and then down to a more light industry area around the Lakemont area. And then no scenicking particularly at all around Bipolar and the lower west part of the yard. Our level of operation depends on the interest and experience of our crews. Walking shoes are necessary. It's uneven ground, and some of the crews log over 2 miles during an operating session. So this is not for the faint of heart or those that don't want a little aerobic exercise. We do have positions for sitting for dispatchers who can sit on the front porch and help coordinate functions in the front yard, as well as in the shade in the Why Not or Bipolar area at the west end. But as I said, pretty much have to walk with your train from the Orville Glacier area around the entire yard, down about 5 or 6 feet in elevation, down to Bipolar, and then back up if your train is looping or if it's terminating at Bipolar. Switches may be distant at times, though they're all manually operated. You can manually override them, but we also have small movable control panels on 10 to 20 foot tethers so that a crew remotely can run the switches, particularly in complex areas or hard to reach areas. So these are powered switches, but they can be overridden. Crews are responsible for returning switches to mainline settings whenever they leave a siding, and to watch for how they are set when they get there. So routing is most complex in the front yard area from the rustic ridge, we call it, area. Trains leaving Glacier may be southbound or northbound, which is a little confusing, but as you can see in this one photo, there is a train heading into Glacier toward us. There's the other leg of the Glacier Y here. A scenic or passenger train is approaching, coming out of, you can't see it, Orville, and it's heading to Somnia. We'll circle around and join the front loop up here and cross over what we call the summit behind this mountain out of sight. We have a logging train here that has left the limber area, and this train right here, this freight with a steam engine, is from this picture probably just out there to entertain visitors between trains. So the front porch operator would keep this train running in circles for passersby and people that are just approaching the layout and don't see a mainline train at the moment. So it's there to keep interest and to keep the dispatcher at his full operating limits. We'll go over this. Again, a train going under the Rustic Bridge. In this case, there we go. Let's go past this one. There's a fence that goes across here with what we'd call tunnels that go through from the front yard to the side yard. It looks sort of like this, and a hatch inside and out to keep the raccoons out when we're not running. Glacier Yard has been reconstructed a couple of times without the backdrop here. The layout is along Glacier because of access to irrigation, electrical, and water to the house has had to be rebuilt on panels that can be lifted. It's on 4 3/4-inch plywood reinforced with 2x6 and on a stone footing that you can't see here. So all of these sections can be hinged and lifted up. The layout has just grown, as I mentioned, sort of organically from the front yard, looped around the side yard. This is what it looked when we first built it, on just dirt and stone on the side, equestrian, just a view from one of the upper bedrooms. And this loop down here at the bottom, we removed. And now the main line continues around sort of here on the front, as well as more hidden toward the back that follows along the fence line. Eventually, as I said, the main line was extended from that point Griswold, and equestrian and Orville sidings were lengthened. Glacier Yard, as I said, has been rebuilt twice. This is sort of what it looks like during an operating session with no trains out, with the backdrops in place. This is the town of Equestrian, and Orville is the line that goes low now and underneath out to the front. So the passageway to the front yard is through these 2 portals, and from Glacier is over here and a gate here in between. Oh, just another view of Griswold and Grizzly Gulch. Let's see this train if it works. Well, it doesn't work. Here we go. Going a little fast. Okay, we're sort of still in the equestrian area, and to operate some of the switches with a little more remote, buildings like this is still under construction, have a small control panel inside them. The roof flips up. This is the equestrian area. This passing siding has been elongated now to 16 feet, and this bridge has been double tracked. And during operation, looks somewhat like this. Steam train, which we don't usually run during operating sessions, sitting at Griswold. And again, the diagram, just a quick view to know where we are. We're right now looking at the town Griswold, and we will continue on around the yard further this way. This is the next town of Batson, which also, since there's a passing track, a long one in the back here and hard to reach, flips up. And there's a control panel for the passing siding to be operated without having to reach or stretch. The scenery progresses, and that's the feature that I'm fairly proud of. You sort of go from one geographic area to another. You're not staying in the same room or on different levels. You actually sort of move from mining areas to agricultural to light industry areas. This is a view of the train now leaving Batson across the bridge to Belfry. It's a 10-foot scratch-built timber bridge in 3 sections. Pretty hard to do maintenance on, but luckily with dead rail, there's less maintenance that you have to do. We clear the weeds once in a while, but they're not a big problem, and the leaves with a blower. And that's about what you have to do. You don't have to clean the rail particularly. You can use a snow plow with the snow. This is a little more wide angle view, so you see that it is a yard, and the grapevines encircle the yard. The trellising is overhead, so you can walk underneath it without banging your head. This is the area of Belfry, no buildings in place there. Overview of the trellising, and to get a glimpse of the backyard, up here is the upper small pond we just saw with the bridge over it. The front line continues down over this waterfall and river. It's called the Rio Grandiose. There's a small bridge here that allows you to go back into this area to both view and for hands-on reasons. And down here is the Lakemont switching area we'll see. This is in early spring, and in summer, it gets completely filled. Some of these vines will grow 16 feet if you don't keep trimming them back with a good production of grapes. Again, this is a view without the growth to give you a swing view of the size of the lower pond and the smaller upper pond that's in the upper part of the yard. That's in Belfry home. And this is Belfry Better Bulls of bull line packers, a nod to my old friend, John Allen, who is a mentor and an incredible modeler on the West Coast. One of my granddaughters standing in Belfry, but it's to point out, you can hardly see, but you can get to the long stretch of the line that goes along the fence, which is a little bit lower than the front line. And you can see a train here back there on it, but you don't notice it too much when you're just viewing it from eye level in the front. One of the more detailed areas at times, we don't completely detail when we're more focused on operating, more on show. And this is the lower end of the Belfry siding and crossing the Rio Grandiose. This is the one-track mine still under development. The footbridge I pointed out going back to the area we call Wirch Junction, and still an undeveloped scenic area and no footing yet in place for Hotel Harper. We were just looking right here at Wirch Junction back through and under the grapevines. We'll look a little more now in the Old Vines area, which to me is the operationally most interesting, where we have a number of industries at Old Vines, Rose Glass, Lakemont, Arbor, and Trellis, and the opportunity to do some very interesting switching maneuvers. This is a view, again, with no buildings out, well, one. And this is with more of the buildings in place, Pluto Power at Old Vines, as well as faulty fuel. This one siding can service about 5 cars at 2 separate locations, the Old Vine station as well as Pluto Power. And this is me enjoying a couple of years ago some of the switching in this vicinity. You'll also see during an operating session, we put these boxes out, and those are typically car card boxes, which I will show you we have repurposed in a different method. This is Trellis Corner, Lakemont here over on the right, with the buildings in place. Now let's go over, not stop the videos. And a train headed out of Lakemont, headed back behind a large storage shed in a very unscenic area, but another part where the tracks are parallel. But keep in mind, this is a single track main line. This is essentially a track. These are both bidirectional tracks for trains that are northbound, southbound on either one leg of the loop. The track here going behind the shed, very compressed. You don't even see it on the schematic. It's right here. the area we call Zinfandel. But then we'll look at Bipolar, an air view of Bipolar to give you a glimpse of how we have the Y that you can walk over, and these sections of the footbridge lift out so that the trains can run on the Y into the basement or turn on the Y. Mostly, again, in operating, we just use it for turning when necessary. These two front tracks are considered to be both staging as well as industrial tracks in the area of Bipolar, and the main line has been changed since this picture was taken to go straight through. Another of the remote panels on a tether, but we can run this entire region, the switches remotely, and the trains can continue to run through or switch without having to reach through and manually hit the turnouts. The long passing siding in the back is lost track. These are trains using the Y with the lift out sections of the footbridge removed. This is the long stretch of the Y that actually backs into the basement. And this is our lower part of our storage area for buildings. This is all under cover, but open to air. And this lower shelf lifts up. In the winter, it looks crowded like something like this with the buildings in place. This lower shelf is hinged and lifts up so you can access the leg of the Y that goes under these stairs and into the basement. Bipolar is one of the few places you can sit for a minute and rest, or it's used also for staging trains. And my granddaughter again showing the area leaving Bipolar through Crusher and out through two more holes in the front fence to go to what we call Lunar Loop out front. This is the area of Crusher. This is a long industrial track coming off of this switch right here before you go through the fence. And this is the loop out front. Not very scenically attractive, but functionally very effective for continuing trains running that are through trains or that need to keep moving. So let's look at operating on the Bears Paw. I call it Ops Light. It tastes great, still filling. Outdoor section, the time usually takes most of the day, morning and afternoon segments. We break the operating into different segments. Some people that don't have the full endurance will just do one or the other segment. We gauge the operating session on the experience of the crew, and for that reason, we call it Ops Light. Takes knowledge of the layout. Obviously, from just walking with me around this layout, you realize you have to learn where all these areas are. Takes a lot of exercise. Good walking shoes are needed. Crews have logged quite some distance, and you got to bend over some to attend to your train once in a while. We have show operating, which mainly is just train crews keeping trains moving, using a crew of about 6 to 8 people, as well as structured operation crews, which is 8 to 14 people. For structured operation, we use the entire outdoor division, but staging takes place in the indoor area of Rotic. I wish we could run just point to point, but we've tried that outdoors, and frankly, it takes so much time to turn your train that it's not so much fun. So we made loops at each end of the layout and do run trains around the entire circuit. During operating sessions, we call it north or southbound, depending on which way you're headed. Call it a loop if you have to, but there are really two ways to get to one place. In other words, leaving Glacier, there are two routes to get to Bipolar. And if you leave Bipolar northbound, you stay northbound all the way through the loop. And if you leave it southbound, you stay southbound, even if you bypass Glacier and return to Bipolar. That keeps the train crews knowing who they are. So northbound and southbound, though it's rather arbitrary geographically, helps crews know who they are. So we don't call them separate lines. They are directions. They're not physical routes. And this is just to demonstrate a little ugly, but a little clearer, that a southbound train leaving Glacier, it would be the green line here with circle around the front yard, and head down through Orville and along the back fence line. We could call it a fence line, but that doesn't sound as much fun. Northbound trains would leave taking this other leg of the Y and the loop around the front, taking the switch at Kaikima and going through Equestrian and around the more scenic route we just viewed. But they would stay northbound through Bipolar if they're a through train, or they're to return to Glacier after doing northbound switching, follow the upgrade through the Grapevine and back eventually to the Y or to Glacier, depending on what their orders are. We put these little things out during operating sessions, little signs, so the crews can look down at a glance, know where they are, and know if they're northbound or southbound, just to keep their reference. These are laminated signs that we've made that go beside the track. Operating sequence is broken into sometimes 3 days. It takes a day, or most of it, to set up our trains with about 60 cars set out on 24 areas of industry in the outdoor setting. So that in itself is a fun session, just running trains out of the basement, staging trains, and placing the cars in the session. We can't leave them out all summer, but we can usually have 3-day segments where the trains can stay out, taking the locomotives under cover, but we can leave the cars in designated sections for a couple of days. The first section, segment, if you will, of an operating busy day will just run trains in one direction or another to get everybody familiar with the layout. They get to run a train, learn to, with a remote control if they're not familiar with the transmitter, learn where the stations are and the sidings, learn what's the main line and what's the siding and where locations are. So it takes people a while to get used to it. That has to be part of the session. And then dispatch trains in opposing directions. Usually we will run a 4-train with 2 trains northbound and 2 trains southbound, 1 each leaving from Glacier and 1 from Bipolar. So these 4 essentially assigned trains for then trailing point switching. Again, to keep trains moving and people interested. It takes a while to switch G-gauge trains, coupling and uncoupling, plus they have to brake their trains. They literally have to set brakes in place so the trains don't roll away. We use full-size spikes, full-size railroad spikes as brakes, and they have to signal or flag protect their train. The session can get more technical on the 3rd day, or we can just do what we call a roundup. Trailing point switching is obvious to all of you, but it's proven to be the optimal complexity for the hardiest of operators in ops light. Trailing point, again, would be if you're northbound, you can switch at the designated areas. If you were told to run your train from Glacier to Bipolar on a northbound route, you would probably bypass Limber. You might be told to switch Equestrian, maybe bypass Batson and switch at Belfry, and wind up at Bipolar for further instructions. We've got forms for this, and we do all of this by radio communication with the dispatcher. There are crossovers, as you can see. There are 6 crossovers, 1 here at Flintstone, 1 down here at Wirtz Junction, 3 in the Lakemont area, and another one in Amnesia. These crossovers can be used for more complicated switching maneuvers when we are regionally operating, and we send out a crew to do a local to the Lakemont area and to switch all 4 or 5 of these areas, and to return, they have to use runarounds. Same thing with the Bipolar area, and a really fun area is the Equestrian area with that have setouts in both north and southbound directions. So you got to do runarounds on a more complicated operating session. So these crossovers are not typically used during a run session, more for our advanced stops, or we can use the crossovers essentially as interchange areas. The dispatcher has to give permission for these use. Dispatcher often, a main dispatcher, it's a little easier job physically and will sit on the front porch, has a panel to help coordinate the complicated movement of trains around the Glacier Y and the summit area where trains from both directions will have to interact. This is a typical dispatcher's guide for 4-train operation. And it shows where typically the meets can be projected. Trains assigned as northbound 101, southbound 102, originating from Glacier or originating from Bipolar. This just gives them a quick glance guide. It's sort of like a line drawing, but it's been easier this way for our dispatchers to kind of get a quick glance of what trains should be meeting and approximately where. In this case, trains told to hold at Orville and meet 102 northbound, southbound meeting north. And the colors, typically yellow is northbound, green is southbound. The dispatcher's panel, we use magnetic panel with movable indicators. Again, typically northbound trains are in yellow and southbound are green. I don't see them here, but we have arrows drawn on the magnets to indicate the direction. One of our chief dispatchers ready to operate here, I can see. Operating crew, not really. This is what one of the operating crews actually may look like with trains, 4 trains sometimes meeting, 2 at Orville and 2 at Equestrian, can be quite congested. Also, with the backs turned to Glacier, somebody hustling trains there at Glacier. A track warrant looks something like this. This is the simplest one. This is an extra local freight northbound, in this case 203, leaving Bipolar through Summit and return to Bipolar, departs via Luna Loop and Clark, returns via Equestrian and Old Vines. They'll know what that is when they look at the map, and the checkoff, and the dispatcher will instruct them as to what trains they are to meet at each of the main stations from which they have to OS. Local extras like this have to stop at each station and OS to the dispatcher, as well as smoke signals watching for and flagging other trains that might be switching. So the train orders, as we just showed, plus radio communications, all trains are running extra using handheld family type radios, such as this. 2-man crews usually, an engineer and a conductor do the switching and do the coupling, and the engineer in charge of train control, such as this. 2-man crew running a train out of Glacier along Rustic Ridge, and the dispatcher keeping a close eye, make sure the train's headed on the right leg of the Y and is going to have to interact with other trains to cross Summit. Typical paperwork we give to an operating crew. Again, we designed these what do I call them? You know, little panels we give to each clipboards we give to each crew. They're designed, they have 3 slots in the bottom for car cards, right? Well, we discovered quite quickly that outdoor train crew operating and car cards is like 52 pickup, and the cards are more distributed all over the yard rather than being practical. So how do we operate? Well, with our instructions to operate the train, and we tell them where to switch, and most likely, again, just referring to the fact all the switches are manual with remote control. This is called a large scale limbo. If you have to do the switch manually. Coupler operation is also all manual, using coupler devices, which are really long handled screwdrivers. And switching has to be braked. All cuts of trains find these full scale spikes handy all over the layout, which they then put to make sure their train is held in place. So safe operation, very important to keep a runaway from leaving Belfry and winding up in Bipolar. A lot of yelling has to take place if that happens. I wish we could use real waybills. This is a Great Northern waybill, an actual one, but doesn't work outdoors. Made up really nice car cards with 4 destination waybills to go in them. Again, really not practical yet in terms of the, if you'll excuse the word, sophistication of most of us large scalers. We really like to run trains and operate trains, which really means this type of functioning on the car cards just isn't practical. But what we've done is converted these car card placards to go at each of the switching locations with a map on each one, so the crews can see clearly that Lakemont is schematically here, and that Trellis and Arborville are over here, or Rosebush is this siding, and which way is north and which way is south. And what we do is we will operate using the method of swapping. The crew will be instructed, if they're to switch at Trellis or at Lakemont, to do a single car swap. In other words, if they see a tank car there and they have a tank car in their consist, they swap out the tank car for their tank car. And this proves to be interesting enough to keep crews involved and feeling like they're actually performing operations on a real railroad. This is what an expanded train order or track warrant begins to look like when we have included such as work equestrian industry. This particular order only has 1 work spot, but this train would leave Glacier and would be told to work equestrian industry. We do that while holding at equestrian, hold equestrian. You may have to meet a train, and the dispatcher would indicate here which train he's going to have to clear the main for to allow that train to meet him. More complicated train forms, which I'm not showing you, will show 2 or 3 work locations or destinations, which we use progressively as the sophistication or the endurance of the crews can manage. We set up trains usually overnight. They can be left out, like I said, for a day or so. Obsession staging is usually done in the basement at the town of Rotic, which is a major division point for then trains which are moved out to Glacier and Bipolar to begin day 2 of operation. This is the schematic of my switch panel for a Rotic inside. This is what an indoor part of a large scale layout looks like under construction. No scenic in this area, but it's a very fun to operate area, which you can stay indoors and it's cool down there and very close to the wine cellar. And this is staging tracks leaving Rotic in the back, which I'll go back, actually has 6 tracks for different destinations, and to assemble trains usually of mixed character, where we try to have at least 1 type of car in each stage train plus caboose. Most trains operated on an operating day are about 8 cars maximum, but we'll have at least 5 different types of cars: a gondola flat, tank, boxcar reefer 6, and a cattle car plus caboose. And all of those can be interchanged in a swap at an industry. When trains are staged outside, these 2 are staged at Bipolar. We have a tank car, boxcar, gondola, reefer. I see no cattle car in this consist, and some extras. That'd be a fun train to leave northbound out of Glacier. And we see a southbound train back here in the back that somebody's picked up several guns and a tank car probably. A hostler beginning to set up trains to arrive at Glacier, and Glacier with the trains busier. Crew walking around the backyard. Again, the layout is in the perimeter, scenic nicely, I think, from the east side of the yard to about this point where it reaches the lower pond, and you step back through underneath the trellising. assistant dispatcher roving around down here at the Lakemont area, but you can see the orientation destination boxes on the post there. They're located in each industrial setting. And again, crews refer to these schematics in order to know where their switching destinations are and if it's a northbound or southbound accessible trailing point. The box is in place. No particular buildings here, very unscenic, but just a glimpse of the trains operating during an op session. Here we're using a steamer, which is rather rare during an op session. Yeah, good place to pause, and we can take some questions. I'll flip through a couple of pictures. This is just to show a roundup train at the end of the session, actually the day after an operating session, taking trains back into Bipolar and ultimately back into the basement. We can run 40 cars, but very carefully.
Yeah, I was going to say that takes some that takes some work at that size.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go back through the questions backwards. Can you operate outside all year?
Yes.
Okay.
There, but not really operate. We can run trains outdoors all year if the snow is light, but if we get icy or there's too much rain, we don't risk the battery powered engines in real wet.
Yep. Let's see. There's a discussion about waterproofing the car cards, or do you put everything under cover during off hours? I thought you said you removed the car boxes.
Yeah, the car boxes are pretty much laminated so they can stay out and the indicators stay out. The cars we move into Bipolar or Glacier areas, which are protected overnight if it looks like we're going to rain. Otherwise, it can be very dry in Portland in the summer, believe it or not. And it's very hospitable to operating.
I was going to say, do you get thunderstorms out there or just rain? Or
no,
okay.
Thunder is so rare. We had a 50 or 50 something day stretch with no rain all summer. Not a so there's more rain in Memphis, way more, twice as much as there is in Portland.
Yeah. I was going to say, I appreciate the for those of you, we were chatting before, Warner is a psychiatrist, so that explains the bipolar, the
lithium springs,
the excellent puns, including the comment from Mark saying that he assumes you use lithium-based batteries. Let's say I do like the Clark, Griswold, and Sparky references. Those are well done there. So. There's a question about standardizing the locomotive decoders. I mean, I thought I heard some sound in at least a few of those.
Yeah. We have switched on my layout all to Revolution. There is no problem. There is essentially, we can run I've got 40 locomotives. There's no problem. We don't have to do any, it's ready to go. We just fire them up.
Okay. Is there a particular type you use, or?
There are a number of different transmitter receiver systems, but Revolution is the best as far as this distance is concerned. RailPro has a beautiful system. It's designed for HO, but you get in a tunnel or behind a mountain and you'll lose contact. Same thing with the dial. I'm blanking on the name of the transmitters. Revolution, though, it's a little bit basic, and the sounds you have to put an additional sound unit if you want, other than just the generic diesel sound, but it has the best reception and stability, and it's the least expensive.
It's a question about how long do the batteries last? Do you get a full operating day out of a charge? Yes,
the lithium batteries in G-scale, we get a full 6 hours at least run, sometimes a full 8 hours if we're not pulling too heavy of a load. So 6 to 8 hours.
You can put some serious batteries in too. I mean, that's that is the bonus of, there's the people trying to do dead rail and HO. It's like, yeah, that's an awful lot to cram in there versus, G gauge where you've got all sorts of space. So
honestly, that was one of my biggest attractions when we were able to, in 1994, we started with lead acid batteries, if you can believe that, and these FAs. they weighed a ton. They were motorcycle batteries, but quickly when we got lithium, the world just changed, and it's
Yeah.
really fun all day.
Well, and they charge significantly faster too.
Oh, yeah.
So. There's a question about, you said you have interchange. How do you work your interchange?
By imagination.
Okay.
Yeah, there's two spots that we just pretend it's an interchange, and trains just have that as another industrial option to drop off a car there and pick it up when you come around the other side.
Okay. All right. I put a link up to your page on my operatingsessions.com site. Do you have a website for your railroad?
No, I don't. No,
Okay.
but it's Bearspaw Southern.
All right. All right. Well, I think that that covers the questions. Like I said, you do have the idea of doing operations on a garden railroad it's rare, as you're saying. I mean, there's just not a lot of them doing it. I think you almost see more operations in the really large scale, the 1/8, the 1/12 than you do in the garden. And I don't know why. It seems like, I think people are missing out, especially if you've got the space like you've got. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. But
It's an emerging segment. It really is. There's
Yeah.
several in San Diego, several in the Bay Area that are really coming around and formally operating, like I said.
well, and you need the weather. I mean, doing that here in Indiana, probably not too practical. It just gets too cold in the winter. But I could see, somewhere temperate would be nice. So, all right.